Hi, this is Paul. I've spent some time over the last couple of weeks going through some of the smaller channels that have grown out of the Bridges of Meaning Discord server and this little community. And there's the Randos United has been, a constant, um, really very reliable place to find conversations from many of the people on the Discord server, especially many of the early ones, and some really amazing conversations. So one of the ones that I wanted to do some commentary on was this one by Sarah and Tripp and Luke and Sam on the rise and fall of Mars Hill. Now, it's about an hour and 20 minutes, and so it would take me a while to go through all of them, so I grabbed some salient spots where to begin. So
Oh,
let's
so
go.
it's like in like the top five podcasts in the world or something at the moment.
Yeah.
It's the first interesting thing Christianity Today has done in at least a decade.
Sam or Hank got a comment about that, and I think what Sam said there is fair. If you read Molly Worthen's take on Christianity Today and the incredible role it played in the post-war period, the 1940s and 50s, it is just in some ways a shadow of what it used to be. Now, if you saw my video on Mark Galli, a lot of this stuff should be in context. Editors plan to rehabilitate conservative Protestants' reputation in the eyes of the American establishment and intellectual elite. Contributing editors included Billy Graham, Edward L.R. Elson, Eisenhower's pastor. An ad campaign in the pages of USA, U.S. and World Report assured leaders in business and politics that Christian faith was crucial to the democratic capitalist way of life. It was never intended that God be ignored from the business scene any more than he could be excluded with impunity from world affairs. In many ways, what the neo-evangelicals in Christianity Today were trying to do in the post-war period was really to revive the prominent place of Christianity in American politics that it had lost during the First World War and wasn't really there in between the wars. Necessary as business and trade journals are, as business leaders also need the help and insight they can receive from Christianity Today, the magazine with a worldview approach to today's problems and pressures. The ad decried the false notions of peace advocated by the Soviets and lamented the socialist specter of strong labor unions at home. They were not just political perils, but spiritual dangers, signs of a civilization drifting from its Christian moorings. The editors aspired to win readers outside the United States as well. Henry wanted a voice in the theological debates underway in Europe. At one point to the board, he argued that the dominance of neo-Orthodox theologians Karl Barth and Emil Brunner had subsided. The liberal theology of Rudolf Bultmann, who was determined to demythologize the Bible and reinterpret its supernaturalisms in existential terms, was on the ascent. This moment of instability opened the way for Christianity Today to enter the fray. Henry recommended that the magazine open bureaus in London and Geneva and publish a German edition. Henry's roots probably sharpened his desire to enter intellectual debates there. Such a transition time in theological leadership takes place only once in a generation and creates a strategic moment for us, he wrote. We have a golden opportunity to step into the situation influenced by the evangelical side. You get a sense of just how significant Christianity Today as a publication wanted to become, and in some pretty dramatic ways succeeded. By most measures, Henry and his colleagues succeeded. People read the magazine. 6 weeks after its founding, 140,000 pastors received the magazine free, and 38,000 paid for it. The number seems small when compared to the circulation of popular magazines like Time, which claimed 2.5 million readers in 1960, yet alongside peer publications, Christianity Today was doing very well, with figures topping those of its venerable mainline analog, Christian Century, whose circulation hovered around 37,000. Now remember, Christianity Today already had 38,000 paid subscriptions and 140,000 free subscriptions. An independent poll in 1958 determined that Christianity Today was the most widely and most completely and most regularly read Protestant magazine, Henry bragged in his autobiography. And on they went from there. Now, I mentioned before that magazines are dead and long live podcasts. So in many ways, the rise of this podcast is something for Christianity Today that it probably wishes to recapture.
There's a lot to talk about. But anyway, we should probably go around and do some introductions about why we care and what our connection is. And I guess I'll go first because I actually probably have the shortest one of those. Is I guess I've never been to a Mars Hill church, but I did grow up kind of half in, half out of larger American megachurchdom. I met my wife in a Bible study of a megachurch that, in a lot of ways was not that different from a Mars Hill church. A little different in some ways, in some important ways, but also not that different. And I'm not sure if I'd never read a full Mark Driscoll book, but I'd probably heard at least a few sermons or something like that, of his prior to his career kind of going off the rails and stuff like that. But I guess I'm just a curious, concerned, barely outside observer of the whole thing. So I'll pass it over to Tripp.
And so they each give their introductions. Again, you can watch the whole video. Give the Randos some love.
Everyone pretty much in the US has had some sort of experience in or with a church.
Now the question is, why is this podcast ranked top 5 in iTunes? And if you know anything about the podcast world, the iTunes rankings are sort of like the Billboard charts with respect to music. Podcasts, thankfully, continue to remain, if Apple and Spotify and Google don't finally manage to corral it and probably kill it. Podcasts do really remain sort of the last bastion of the open internet in many ways. Now, one of the interesting things is that there are a lot of podcasts like this that aren't Christian. In fact, Dr. Jim just sent me a podcast called We Crashed. Now, it's a relatively short podcast, but one of the things that struck me about We Crashed, the rise and fall of WeWork, is just how many parallels and similarities there are to the rise and fall of Mars Hill. And Sarah is making this observation here.
So the fact that it's widely appealing doesn't really surprise me. It actually reminds me a lot of, there's a podcast I listened to last year called The Dream that is set up very similarly, but it covers multi-level marketing. And I think the appeal of that is a lot of people who listen to it either had been involved in some sort of multi-level marketing and gotten burned, or else they are just really annoyed by it. So, I mean, I think a lot of the same dynamics of the attraction of that podcast relate to this one too, because, some part of the story you'll recognize in your own experience, I think, if you've had any church experience at all.
Mm-hmm.
So We Crashed basically chronicles the rise and fall of Adam Newman's WeWork. And one of the interesting things that I noted in terms of the parallel of this podcast is not only all of the ways in which Mark Driscoll embodied one of these young entrepreneurs. And if you knew anything about what was really at the height of the church growth movement and the church planting movement that were really going on hot in the 90s and aughts, it was pastors ought to be extremely entrepreneurial for the kingdom of God. And so if you listen to any of these business podcasts, you'll hear very interesting parallels. Now, this little section here is quite interesting because it talks about when Adam Newman met who would be his future wife, Rebecca. And, well, here's a little clip from that.
He was smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. Adam recognized how different they were, but also saw something they shared.
The place where we're very similar is we're extremely entrepreneurial, and we both think really big.
Around the same time, Adam met the other person who, as he tells it, would provide balance in his life. Her name was Rebecca. Rebecca had tried and failed to make it as an actor, yet she knew a thing or two about dreams of success coming true. Her first cousin is Gwyneth Paltrow. At the time they met, Rebecca was 29, a year older than Adam. For their first date, the couple went to dinner. Adam would later tell a conference he showed up not exactly looking his best.
She said, "You're all sweaty. What, do you come here on your bicycle?" And I said, "I actually did come here on my bicycle. I'm an entrepreneur and I'm saving money."
He couldn't buy me dinner or even afford a taxi.
Rebecca recalled that first meeting with Adam in an interview with the School of Greatness podcast.
He was making baby clothes when we met. His first endeavor was called crawlers. He made babies pants with knee pads so that when crawling babies would crawl, their knees wouldn't hurt. He did not have kids. No one he worked with had kids. The baby clothes did not actually fit kids. It was really a hot mess.
She said, as I said, you talk this big talk, you're broke.
I had just come off a month in the woods up at Omega, eating strictly vegan, meditating a few hours a day, and getting certified as a Jivamukti yogi.
I said, "You don't know that I'm broke." And he said, "Yes, I do. I can tell. Anybody who talks about money doesn't have any."
So my intention when I met him was just, how do we expand this good vibration to the planet?
She said to me, "You know what your problem is? You don't understand the game of life." And I said, "The game of life? Of course I do." She said, "Prove it. What does success mean?" And I said, "Success is whoever dies the oldest with the most money." She looked at me and said, "Exactly. You do not understand the game of life."
I could kind of see into the future. I knew that there was no ceiling on his potential.
I said, "Well, why don't you tell me what success means?" She said, "Success is the person who at their 80s is surrounded by the most loved ones, the most family members, has created the most impact on this planet, has connected to something greater than themselves, and don't forget, had a great time doing it."
I just knew that he was going to be the man that was going to save the world.
I was so blown away by that. I proposed within 30 days.
And we got married a few months after that. Yeah, it was quick.
And I decided that I'm going to explore this spiritual practice called the game of life.
Now what's interesting here is some of the connections that you'll hear between Seattle and the culture of Seattle, and in many ways the reactionary culture of Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll. There's always, again, as I noted with Nadia Boltz-Weber, there's always these like opposite dynamics that are going on. Of course, a place like Mars Hill would really push back against sort of the New Age framing of, religion and the world and changing the world and all of these kinds of things that you'll find in a story like this, but yet it's conversant in that culture. And people can sort of flip within these same waters, and they're still surrounded by these waters. And so part of what makes the rise and fall of Mars Hill is it's in some ways just like how many business podcasts about, well, what does it take to start a business? Well, a la Steve Jobs, well, you need to have a spiritual vision. Oh, well, I thought we were making stuff or providing office space. Or no, you must have a spiritual vision. It's about transformation. And so if you watch things like Apple marketing, or recently Apple just had another product, all these product announcements are now coming out during COVID on the internet, and it's all using the same buzzwords. I mean, buzzwords are holy words. On Twitter this morning, I was complaining about the production values of the rise and fall of Mars Hill, and again, Dr. Jim the cardiologist from Idaho sent me an email after I mentioned him in a previous video, and he sent me this recommendation. And I always listen to what Dr. Jim sends me because Dr. Jim is usually right. And listening to this podcast, I realized, the Christianity Today podcast is just following the podcast script. I, of course, am not. It's, hi, this is Paul. Paul Anleitner suggested on Twitter that someone should meme my "Hi, this is Paul," and he mentioned exactly the guy who's already done it. Hi, this is Paul. 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 Hi, this is Paul.
Sweeteners. That's it.
Paul. And I had no idea I even did that. And so I was self-conscious of that for about a week after I did that and completely went on to forget about it. But listen to this. You know, this is just the way podcasts are supposed to be. You know how Rise and Fall always has their, you know, the music from, and it's always the same music. It's like, how many episodes are there going to have to be? And, you know, all of this music.
With every big investment, Adam Neumann's confidence, or some would say his ego, got bigger. And even as more big-name investors came on board, Adam's grip on the company didn't loosen. In fact, it got tighter.
The ownership structure was set up such that there were two classes of stock.
NYU Business School professor Scott Galloway.
That's not unusual.
And again, notice, well, we're going to bring in a college professor to talk about this, just like on the Mars Hill podcast. I mean, as Sam noted, this is straight out of Christianity Today. And as Sarah noted, this is just like how many other podcasts are out there talking about, you know, the fall of these unicorn businesses and the entrepreneurs and their control freaks and everything that they do.
Over the last 10 years, for companies run by entrepreneurs to negotiate based on how hot the company is, a different class of shares so they maintain control. But this took it again to a new level.
Adam negotiated so that his shares in the company got 10 votes for every 1 vote by any other shareholder.
Essentially, Adam controlled the company.
Adam also continued to pump up the value of WeWork, expanding the vision of the sales pitch.
They tried to position themselves as a technology company and used a lot of terms that are more unique or more common across the technology industry.
WeWork didn't have much actual technology, but in the pitch deck,
Notice the music underneath. And again, I was complaining about this on Twitter this morning too. And, you know, it reminds me of preaching and then suddenly the organist, not in a Christian Reformed church usually, this will be in a Baptist church or a black church or something, and the musician will come in and it'll just start playing right underneath my preaching to bring us all to this moment. And well, this is podcasting, I guess.
Sent to investors. The company said it built software to accelerate how it could design and develop spaces.
You mentioned that WeWork does a lot of tech as well.
A lot of people might be surprised to know that we have more engineers in WeWork than contractors, architects, and designers. For the Internet of Things and anybody who wants to create connected space, our members will be able to work with it and build into it and hack space, which we think is very exciting.
Its bread and butter was the real estate business, but it was making itself look like a fast-growing tech company. Mammoth growth predictions, disrupting a stodgy industry, targeting millennials. Plenty of investors had money to spend. They didn't want to miss out on what was being touted as the next Uber.
It was a manifestation of a unique point in time where disruptive or interesting ideas with a charismatic leader were attracting such insanely cheap capital.
Sound familiar?
That they could do insanely irrational things.
Adam was living the dream, hanging with Ashton Kutcher, flying on private jets. Life was very different if you were an average WeWork employee.
They have the coolest wallpaper.
The first time Tara Zoomer set foot in a WeWork in the Bay Area, she knew right away it wasn't your average work situation.
Lots of motivational sayings and posters like hustle harder, thank God it's a Monday.
Now what's interesting again is that Mark Driscoll's culture would be totally reactive to this kind of thing, but yet it completely flows with it and is in some ways like opposite.
Those slogans were kind of repeated throughout.
When Tara started at WeWork in spring 2015, she was used to working in your typical office cube farms, beige and blue with fluorescent lighting. WeWork had foosball tables, meditation rooms.
It's kind of like walking by an open Santa's workshop, only everybody has a different kind of workshop.
Tara's official title was Associate Community Manager.
I had never had a title like that before, so to be perfectly honest, I wasn't too sure what it meant, except basically what the title sounds like. My job would be part of building community.
Tara was making $42,000 a year, a pretty significant pay cut from her last job, but it was a foot in the door at one of the hottest startups in the world.
We now have like fabled tales of what it's like to be an early employee at Facebook or
just like church planting. Oh, back in the day at Willow Creek, you can hear Rick Warren talk about that. You can hear Bill Hybels talk about that.
Google or any of these others. And WeWork really had a similar air about it. And I remember just feeling like I was in the right place at the right time.
Tara's job was to keep WeWork's hundreds of tenants at this location happy. She fluffed the couch pillows, ordered office supplies, gave tours to prospective tenants. She even learned how to change a keg.
I went to one event that was like, I think it was called like Retox Detox. And it was like a yoga drinking event, which was fun. It was like you do yoga and then you get to drink Moscow Mules after.
These events meant plenty of late nights for Tara, followed by early mornings back at the office.
And then to have to wake up and, you're only on a Wednesday and you got to do this 2 more times, that is taxing.
At first, she didn't mind the grind.
I felt really ambitious at the beginning. Like, I'll crush it. I'll get a raise. This will be workable. And then as you're working and you're working harder than you've ever worked in your life and the stress is starting to get to you, pretty quickly I started asking questions about, well, how are we going to rotate? And then if, employees get sick or something happens, like how are we going to keep up with this and how are we going to make this sustainable?
She says there were many weeks she was working 70 hours or more on that $42,000 a year salary.
When you actually break down the hourly rate, it dips down quite a bit. And sometimes I think it would dip me close to minimum wage or less. I'm really almost like going broke working. There was just a day that my bank account had been overdrafted and I had to write my coworker and I said, hey, can you send me some money really quick so I can come into the office and get there? And luckily my coworker is really awesome and she helped me out.
And what's amazing is you can hear, I was just listening to one of the latest versions of the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. And this from the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill.
You survey the literature of church leadership. There's always a lot of language about sacrifice, going the extra mile, staying in the fight. And that's true of megachurches, and it's true of the smallest churches in the country. Sacrifice of some sort is to be expected, and most committed Christians are ready to give their time, their money, or their energy to the mission of their churches. And to be sure, for the Christian, the use of that language is totally legitimate. The New Testament's full of it, and church history is full of the stories of saints who give their lives away to others. Nate's own story actually
the music underneath
has that kind of witness in it, with Toppy walking him by hand through the streets of London, praying with him, staying with him until he knew he'd be okay. But it's so easy for that language to be manipulated, and for leaders to leverage it to accomplish ends that might not ultimately be about the kingdom of God or the love of their neighbor. On an earlier episode, I mentioned that someone said to always ask who benefits. That came from Jesse Bryan, and it was about exactly this. Who benefits when leaders are calling for sacrifice from their staff and volunteers?
The question is always, who benefits from the conversation? Who benefits from this conversation? Does the congregation benefit or does the speaker benefit? Who benefits by getting a bunch of really good-hearted people to not only work jobs so that they can take care of their families and tithe, but also give 20 hours a week at the church? Who benefits? Right? I mean, there was a time, I was gone by then, where they said you had to work 6 days a week because in the Bible, they only had 1 day off. It was like, great. You know who actually got 2 days off every week? It wasn't the rest of the staff. All of a sudden, it's like, fantastic. Guess what? We just dropped our overhead by 12% because we're getting 1 extra day out of everyone. And we're going to grind them into the dirt if we have to. You know why? Because God needs us. That's how it works. That's the machine. You make bread out of their bones and you serve it to people for communion.
When people have spent years building some kind of ministry machine, a spectacle online and in person that was ostensibly meant for the good of the kingdom of God, when they've sacrificed untold hours, taken smaller paychecks, done all the things that are often asked of people in ministry for the sake of the church, when they've given their lives away, and in the end seen it collapse and seen it exposed as being in service of one person, you can hardly blame them when they ask if the whole thing was a fraud.
So, very interesting. This part from Sam I thought was really excellent.
Yeah, I feel like to describe what I feel like the Civil War is briefly, that hasn't really started yet, but I think everyone knows that maybe Fort Sumter's already happened, and the sides are polarizing pretty quick. It's something, and this is another reason why it's so kind of weird and rich that Christianity Today is hosting this podcast, because, well, like a little bit of background on Christianity Today. Christianity Today is basically the publishing arm of the Billy Graham movement that is still around, right? It's in Wheaton, Illinois, right next to Wheaton College, right? Mm-hmm. Which right next to the Billy Graham Center. And Willow Creek is just, up the road, which is sort of like the archetypal founder of American suburban megachurches that started in Chicago, right? And it's like, Christianity Today was so immersed in that world that was its like audience, that was its history. But now that world is splitting, and like, I don't know how to say this any more briefly than it's really splitting more or less along Trump lines.
Now, I'm not sure about that. Trump certainly has been a splitter. He's been a wedge within the church, and especially within the evangelical church. Russell Moore, Beth Moore, this whole fight about Christian nationalism, all of this. But the split has been going on since the Willow Creek days and the rise of the emergent church, because if there's something that Nadia Bolz-Weber and Mark Driscoll and Rob Bell, they all have in common, it's the emergent movement, because they all come from that emergent movement. And that emergent movement split, I used to say it split into two, but now I really say it split into three segments. One is the young, restless, and reformed. One is the progressive evangelicals. And the third are the neo-sacramentalists. And what's interesting is that in many ways, when a little bit later when we get into this video, a lot of the people in this video are really attacking neo-sacramentalists. The neo-sacramentalists are going Anglican, Orthodox, Roman Catholic. The young, restless, and reformed tend to be going towards these Acts 29, Mark Driscoll type churches. And of course, Luke has been all over the map. But Sam is staying pretty much evangelical, though in the crazy ways that he has to, being a non-Trinitarian. Sarah and Luke are tacking towards orthodoxy. Tripp is sort of in the Anglican camp, but this is all sort of the breakdown or the continued evolution of Billy Graham and the neo-evangelicals. And in many ways, it separates along the lines of some of the things that I talked about in the question and answer. Today's Friday that I'm recording this. Thinking, you have sort of your rationalism of the magisterial reformed, of course, the behaving literalistically, biblicistically, like the Anabaptists, but then it's right worship or right liturgy of sort of the neo-sacramentalists. And so now Trump fits into this, but it's not going to break according to Trump, even though Trump is going to break a lot of this.
Is that the same way that the American suburbs sort of flipped from lightly red to lightly blue in the 2016 and 2020 elections? Well, that's having an effect on the politics inside church. And there's basically like a light blue and a red side of American megachurches. And there are all sorts of questions that polarize along that, like egalitarian gender roles, complementarian gender roles, women in church office, no women in church office, slightly friendlier stance on LGBT questions, not a friendly stance, critical race theory, kind of, no critical race theory, right? Like all of these questions are splitting, and it's just almost perfectly a Trump question, really, at the end of the day.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. I'm curious, Sarah, like, obviously there's some things that you said that you've experienced in your past, and everyone, like, you hear my take on the complementarian thing. I rambled about that for an hour with Paul Vanderklay, so I don't need to say anything else. But I'm curious your take on it, given your experience, and what was your experience, and why did this resonate with you, and what are you still working through?
And we need to elevate female voices, so.
Or do we? Is that the question?
Should we keep them quiet? It's just such a mixed bag. I feel like there's so many areas that are still fuzzy for me. We're still in the midst of not knowing where we belong as far as church goes, not feeling at home. anywhere yet, even though we're moving towards orthodoxy. We're still in an evangelical church, still in leadership, and haven't left yet. My husband's still an elder. I lead the music for the most part, so we're pretty embedded, and it hasn't been an easy out, and yet we feel like we can't stay, probably because of how we've experienced. In a lot of ways, it's the authoritarian and church hierarchy stuff. So I'd say that's probably my biggest interest in all of this. The whole complementarian egalitarian issue has not really been that much of an issue in our church experiences. It was, when I was growing up, we were in a very charismatic authoritarian church, but it was actually quite egalitarian. The pastor's wife was also called pastor. She was on the same level. And I think that whole word of faith movement, which was what we stemmed from, tends more egalitarian in a lot of ways. I mean, they have women that are prophets and go around. I
commented on this in my Friday question and answer too, because John had asked about, the Charismatics and where are they? And they're really in their own place apart, and how they've managed all of these things that are sort of fracturing the magisterial, thinkery, rational, we're going to explain the Bible, that hasn't really worked the same way in the Charismatics. And so, I mean, the Christian church is vast, and these pressures and issues in society break out in different ways in different churches.
Speaking and preaching and all of that. So that wasn't as much the issue. Again, I'd say it's more the hierarchy and authority, and how that is supposed to work itself out in the church. I'm not under the illusions that, the Orthodox Church or the Catholic Church doesn't have problems in its hierarchy. Obviously, that's true.
Not the Catholic Church.
Yeah, not the Catholic Church. But
and this is where we get into the question of ecclesiology, which is one of the issues that is always sort of in the background of the rise and fall of Mars Hill. But every group struggles with ecclesiology. It's the problem of wineskins.
I think it was interesting, Sam. I was looking back a few weeks ago to your 4 Ps and how you related them to the different churches. I don't remember which exactly you put where, but the emphasis in the Orthodox Church of right worship, or I think was where you kind of put the Orthodox Church in. And to us, that's kind of why we're leaning that way. It's like, well, if the pastor or priest is having a lot of issues and their life is not exactly how it should be, at least your worship is correct, is right, and you can still attend and still receive the sacraments, and it can be okay. As opposed to our experience, and just relating that back to Mars Hill, if the head lead pastor is doing the things they're doing and they have the freedom and ability to take the church in this direction or that direction, it can just pull the whole thing down and drag all the people along with it. So I guess that'd be a starting off point.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because Protestantism in many ways was supposed to try and break free from hierarchy, right? A lot of the Protestant Reformation was, man, this hierarchy is corrupt. Man, they have too much power. We need to give more power to the laity. We need to give more power to the common folk and have more congregational participation in leadership decisions, etc. That was like one of the main points of the Protestant Reformation. But a weird thing that can happen is when you get rid of some structure, is that anarchy can lead to tyranny very quickly. And honestly, one of the things that in this podcast that I found the most bone-chilling story, at least that related to me, was when Driscoll was basically trying to change the bylaws of the church. And there was one of the elders who was a lawyer who was kind of standing in the way, although not like trying to stand in the way. He thought he was just doing his job of like trying to be like, hey guys, this is really important and we have to be very thoughtful and considerate when we change the bylaws because this is important stuff, right? And Driscoll just steamrolled him and got him basically excommunicated, even though he hadn't done any heresy that I could tell, and I'm pretty good at noticing, and he hadn't done any moral action on those things. And Driscoll was able to use his influence and charisma and whatever to basically have a kangaroo show trial for the guy and get him plowed out of the way so that Driscoll could make the bylaws such that he had more centralized power, right? I thought that was one of the most terrifying things in the whole podcast, and no one, that wasn't picked up on by nearly as many people. But I guess that,
and it should be also noted that it's not just in non-denominational churches that these kinds of things happen. What can happen if you have a tyrannical leader within a church with a lot of hierarchy and structure is that that leader can sometimes wield the structure and the hierarchy, whereas Mark Driscoll could perhaps bully some who are outside of his structure, but for the most part was contained within that structure.
that also kind of relates to my own story and what scares me when churches start doing things. But that was one of those things where it's like, I feel like a lot of times the podcast sometimes over exaggerates Driscoll's faults and tells it from a one-sided story. But that was one of those things where I'm like, I wish they'd gone into that more. And that really made, that was the time that I felt like I most clearly and unambiguously was siding against Driscoll and what he was doing and the stuff that he was up to.
So, yeah, well, that's a huge one, because I think I could talk about elder-led churches, particularly in those kind of young, restless, and reform communities, and I think how that plays out practically in creating kind of an implicit culture that even if you don't have a kind of charismatic, authoritarian kind of, and potentially manipulative leader like Driscoll, you'll still get a lot of the same effects, just in a really implicit way in those churches. And I've experienced that in a lot of ways in elder-led churches. And one of the other churches that I've attended besides Sovereign Grace a bunch was, I went to Bethlehem for a couple years, and I live in Minneapolis. And so,
is that John Piper's church?
Yep. And so I continue to know people. I mean, he's no longer there, really. He's not leading it anymore, but they're currently going through a big break and having a big issue and having infight like this. What's interesting to me is the whole Driscoll phenomenon is it's not an isolated event. Like it's I think symptomatic of a much deeper disease, because these elder-led churches, because really within Protestantism, like that's my understanding, like that's your choice. You have elder-led churches and you have Congregationalist churches, which are essentially just democratic.
Well, there's a lot more variety within Protestantism. You have magisterial Reformed churches that you can have things like the United Methodists that have bishops. You can have things like Lutherans. A lot of Lutheran churches have bishops of sorts. They preserved much more of the hierarchical ecclesiology of the Roman Catholic and the Anglican. And then you have more Presbyterian models, which tend to be the elder-led churches. It varies quite a bit. And most of these attempts try to get at these issues structurally, but as I think we've seen in politics lately, structures can only actually function when the people within them have an understanding of how the structure is supposed to function and then freely participate and reinforce the structure in its functioning. Otherwise, I don't think you can really, almost any structure can be abused.
Although it runs like, a democracy based off facet from my experience is how kind of these more feminine modes of, because if you don't have a really assertive, hyper masculine leader like Driscoll, I noticed that a lot of the manipulation and repression and stuff works through shame and indirect communication and like fear of, I don't know if
I listened to Jordan Peterson's recent podcast, and of course Peterson has all these Jungian categories, and so you'll talk about the the good patriarchy versus the tyrannical patriarchy, and the good feminine versus the tyrannical feminine, or the devouring feminine. And I think Luke is trying to get at some of these things. And I can't believe he doesn't finish all of his sentences. What a horrible thing.
This came up much, but gossip was such a big thing. Like, you start talking
reputation.
And I love this section of this conversation too, because, and I've seen this so very often in certain kinds of churches.
I don't know if this came up much, but gossip was such a big thing. Like, you start talking
reputation destruction.
Yeah, you start talking to young, restless, and reformed people who've gone to these kinds of churches about how, just ask any of them about conversations around gossip. It came up a lot. Anytime anyone would have issues about authority and what was happening and decisions would be being made, I guarantee you someone, because it was just like propaganda, almost just implicitly brainwashed into you, that someone would just be like, no, we don't want to be gossipy. We don't want to gossip. We don't want to slander leadership. We don't want to, and it would just.
So that was one of the ways that leadership would exert control over conversation is
and I
by.
Don't even think it was. Yeah, I don't even think it was conscious.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even think they were trying to do it. When I got together with my book club last week and I was listening to this, I knew this conversation was coming. A lot of these guys have been at Bethlehem, or they currently are at Bethlehem. I have a guy in my book club who teaches at Bethlehem College as an adjunct professor, who knows Joe Rigney, and this is Bethlehem's whole issue of what they're going through. And guess what somebody said as we started talking about it? I mean, just guess. Oh, we got to be careful. We don't want to start, I don't want to gossip about this. And, oh, really? I'm surprised that came up. Weird.
Whenever I hear gossip brought up in contexts like this, I immediately think about Jonathan Haidt's The Happiness Hypothesis, which is, of the books that he's written, is my favorite book. I think it's the broadest. And, well, here, it's amazing when I go back over books that I've read. I read this book, 10 years ago. Maybe less, I don't know. Talking about the Dunbar number. Robin Dunbar has demonstrated that within a given group of vertebrate species, primates, carnivores, ungulates, birds, reptiles, or fish, the logarithm of the brain size is almost perfectly proportionate to the logarithm of the social group size. In other words, all over the animal kingdom, brains grow to manage larger and larger groups. Social animals are smart animals. Dunbar points out that chimpanzees live in groups of around 30. Like all social primates, they spend enormous amounts of time grooming each other. Human beings ought to live in groups of about 150 people, judging from the logarithm of our brain size. And sure enough, the studies of the hunter-gatherer groups, military units, and city dwellers address books suggest that 100 to 150 is the natural, quote-unquote, group size within which people can know just about everything directly by name and face and know how each other is related to everyone else. But if grooming is so central to primate sociality, and if our ancestors began living in larger and larger groups, for some reason, such as to take advantage of new ecological niche with high predation risks, at some point grooming became an adequate means of keeping in one another's relationships. Dunbar suggests that language evolved as a replacement of physical grooming. Language allows small groups of people to bond quickly and to learn from each other about the bonds of one another. Dunbar notes that people do in fact use language primarily to talk about other people, to find out who is doing what to whom, and who is coupling with whom, who is fighting with whom. And as Dunbar points out, that our ultra-social species, success is largely a matter of playing the social game as well. It's not what you know, it's who you know. In short, Dunbar proposes that language evolved because it enabled gossip. Individuals who could share social information using any primitive means of communication had an advantage over those who could not. And once people began gossiping, there was a runaway competition to master the art of social manipulation, relationship aggression, reputational management, and all of which requires even more brain power. Nobody knows how language evolved, but I find Dunbar's speculation so fascinating, I love to tell people about it. It's not good gossip, after all. It's not good gossip after all. You don't know Dunbar. If you are like me, you have the urge to tell your friends about anything you learn that amazes or fascinates you. And this urge itself illustrates Dunbar's point. We are motivated to pass on information to our friends. We even sometimes say, I can't keep it in. I have to tell somebody. And when you do pass a piece of juicy gossip, what happens? Your friend's reciprocity reflex kicks in, and she feels the slight pressure to return the favor. If she knows something about the person or the event in question, she is likely to speak it up. Oh, really? Well, I heard that gossip elicits gossip, and enables us to keep track of everyone's reputation without having to witness their good or bad deeds personally. Gossip creates a non-zero-sum game because it costs us nothing to give each other information, yet we both benefit by receiving information. Because I'm particularly interested in the role of gossip in our moral lives, I was pleased when a graduate student in my department, Holly Hom, told me she wanted to study gossip. In one of Holly's studies, she asked 51 people to fill out a short questionnaire each time over the course of a week that they took part in a conversation that went for at least 10 minutes. We then took only records in which the topics of conversation was another person, which gave us one episode of potential gossip per person per day. Among our main finding, gossip is overwhelmingly critical, and it is primarily about moral and social violations of others. For college students, this means a lot of talk about sexuality, cleanliness, and drinking habits of their friends and roommates. People do occasionally tell stories about the good deeds of others, but such stories are only 1/10 as common as stories about transgressions. When people pass along high-quality, juicy gossip, they feel more powerful. They have the best shared sense of what is right and what is wrong, and they feel more closely connected to their gossip partners. A second study revealed that most people hold negative views of gossip and gossipers, even though almost everyone gossips. When we compared people's attitudes about gossip to the social function that gossip serves, Holly and I came to believe that gossip is underappreciated. In a world of no gossip, people would not get away with murder, but they would get away with a trail of rude, selfish, and antisocial acts, often oblivious to their own violations. Gossip extends our moral, emotional toolkit. In a gossipy world, we don't just feel vengeance and gratitude towards those who hurt us or help us. We feel pale, but still instructive flashes of contempt and anger towards persons who we might not even know. We feel vicarious shame and embarrassment when we hear about people whose schemes, lusts, private failings are exposed. Gossip is a policeman and a teacher. Without it, there would be chaos and ignorance. Now, it's very interesting in Christian terms, of course, when churches sort of try to clamp down through gossip and clamp down on gossip. As Sam noted, it's sort of a way to control speech, and it's never successful. It is never successful because churches then have socially acceptable ways to gossip, like through prayer requests and all sorts of other ways to at least keep the community alive. And in this case, a lot of the New Testament's warning about gossip makes a lot of sense because, as you can tell from Haidt's book, there can be a fairly negative spiral that can take place. At the same time, gossip is essential to, in some ways, keep tyranny under control. What's interesting about the Mars Hill podcast is that you often get the sense that some of these people are telling the stories for the first time. Now, earlier on in this conversation, they asked the question, well, why is this podcast so popular? The word out there was failure porn, which is a very interesting term. We love to tell stories about failure. Why? Because we don't want to fail and we want to learn from failure. So there's a certain fascination that goes on with failure. And right away, even when I started making some videos about this podcast, a number of people basically said, I don't like talking negatively about the church. And they have a good point. Yet there's this social function that goes into it, which basically makes it challenging as a Christian to figure out, how can I participate in a vital social interrelational network in a good way, out of love for the other, for the sake of the other, for the sake of the institution, while at the same time keeping some of these elements that hold the institutions accountable. And part of what you see in a story like this is that dictatorial leaders will really work hard at undermining many of the mechanisms that could, in fact, hold them accountable. Another one of the themes that comes up in here is worship vis-a-vis entertainment. And this is a really big topic, and it's treated really well. This is Tripp, and it's his uncle, who's actually his wife's uncle, who's James Wellman, who's been writing this book on worship. And I think that book, not on worship, on megachurches, I think it handles it right, because there's a lot to this. People's preferences for, let's say, now in a response to this kind of big box enthusiasm worship, especially when there are leaders who get tyrannical. It sort of undermines, I think, people, if they've really, how to say it, if they've been moved by the power of mass worship with all of the cultural and technological tools at hand, which is what megachurches do, and then there's a falling, then they often look for something that feels safer, like liturgical worship, that feels more under control. It's already on paper. It transcends the leadership of this particular church, pretty much exactly what Sarah had just said before.
Essentially. Which is easy in Seattle, because then we're creating reactionary activists, right? So now you're countercultural, which gets even more attention to the church and that kind of stuff. So it was a good, sales technique to be kind of an anti-progressive activist in Seattle, because then you just get a lot more eyeballs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that emphasis on appearance and so what you just said, Tripp, about that the church was really good at providing a certain kind of emotional, spiritual experience when you were there, right? They put a lot into production. They cared really a whole lot about music and had really good musicians, and maybe had some sort of, stagecraft of, I don't know if they had smoke machines or whatever, but, like they put a lot of intentional effort into that. And that sort of spiritual experience that you can get going to a church like that kind of blurs the lines between entertainment and liturgy a little bit. Is it can give you the
and it would do us a lot of good to continue to ponder what we mean by those words and how they interoperate those realms, because it's not all negative.
The impression that you're growing spiritually because you have a deep and profound spiritual experience when you're at the church, but that's not the same thing as spiritual growth and growing in holiness and righteousness and stuff like that.
It's like eating sugar, essentially. Like, you're getting like a little bit of like a sugar high, but it's not healthy for you. It's not going to help you achieve your health goals or anything else like that. But it's eating candy. That's what a lot of it, really, I feel like was.
Mm-hmm. And
again, back to sort of the post-seeker boomer movement. You have progressive evangelicals, you have young, restless, and reformed, and then you have neo-sacramentalists. And of course, still in a fourth track, the evangelical arm keeps going too. And what Driscoll did was actually sort of blend the evangelical and the young, restless, and reformed. Because first he was sort of hardcore young, restless, and reformed, and then he went just sort of full-blown mega.
Another part of this is like the mixture between like capitalism and church strategy, growth, whatever is part of this, because it's like a downside. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm going to go rail against capitalism or something like that, but a downside is like it can Luke would be right there with me, I know, but that like it can prioritize the expedient and the superficial, and there's competition for people to give you the thing that is most superficially and instantaneously gratifying, right? And there isn't as much competition for the long-term benefit, because that is harder to do, and you'll get beat if someone's playing if you're playing a long-term game and someone else is playing a short-term game, they'll beat you in the short term, and they could drive you out of business in the short term, so the long-term game doesn't get to happen because it's undercut.
It's harder to do, it's harder to measure, and the payoff is longer.
Yes.
And so in that you'll get undercut by your competition.
Right.
Now, vital here also is it's an undercurrent within the podcast of the religious marketplace. And these guys are actually going to go into that. Let's see if that's the next point. I just put my notes right in their comments. Yeah, maybe go that, and then we'll hit the sex stuff.
And the next generation, maybe grandkids, but there's a reason for that. It's not because of the church and the structure in and of itself. It's because of the built-in limitations that I said again. Like you can't. It's scale. It's the economies of scale thing. The kind of consumeristic, capitalistic, propagandistic stuff doesn't play there as much because it can't, because there's not options. And the community is built in where like all these people know each other, and like that church, like not going to that church has so many other things playing into it that like they just it's not viable.
I think that there's so many ways in which this pattern is playing out that the last couple American generations wanted to give their kids more freedom and more choices than they had, right? So they're like, their goal wasn't to give their kids the one church that they were going to definitely be in. They wanted to be like, oh, well, of course, I want you to be able to choose for yourself, right? That the gift that I want to pass on to the next generation is freedom of choice. And like, iterate that a couple times, and now it's like, oh my goodness, there's so many choices, it's existentially terrifying. Right. And like, how do I choose? How do I know what I want? I don't, and there's some part of it that's like, at some point, I don't want to be able to choose. I want to be told what I'm doing.
That's like my experience exactly. That's my favorite thing about Orthodoxy. Like even when I started going there, I was just like, this is overwhelming. I don't know a ton of stuff. It's uncomfortable. But I said, but I don't, like there's nothing, my opinions
doesn't matter.
Are irrelevant. And so I was just like, and that's so awesome.
Now, there's a real irony in here in that the reaction to tyrannical, authoritarian abuses in the marketplace evangelical church is the hierarchical orthodoxy of a very rigid, long-term hierarchy. For as long as you trust it. Because those are the trade-offs. You would expect them to try to go to even a flatter model, because Driscoll's authoritarian, part of the thing that the podcast does repeatedly is emphasize Driscoll's avaricious authoritarian appetites basically having his way with the people of the church and consuming them, where, as in the words of the prophets, the shepherds fleece the sheep. And the answer to this is, let's go to a place where the structure is all there. It's very hierarchical. The liturgy's all set. But it's still a consumer choice. And that begins to be where then these guys go with this.
And he makes up for it by getting on these calls with us.
Huh?
And you make up for it by getting on these calls with us.
Maybe.
No, I think you're right. There's even like marketing and psychological research that when people have too many options on like a menu at a restaurant, they're less happy with their choice.
For sure.
Like even if like objectively their choice is if you just did like a blind taste test or something with a smaller menu, but the sheer size of the menu like makes you constantly second guess or wonder, what else could I have had instead of this? Right? Yeah, exactly.
That's dating apps, right? Same problem.
Right.
Yeah.
It's true on so many levels. The online dating, there's, food choices when you go into Costco, et cetera, on down the list. It's just
the Trader Joe's model is the opposite of that. That's one of the big reasons Trader Joe's works. And somebody was telling me this the other day, and I had never thought about it. But like, you go to Trader Joe's, you go to a regular grocery store, and you're looking for black beans. There's like 12 versions. You go to Trader Joe's, there's one. There's one can of black beans. There's one type. So like when you go to the grocery shop, it's just like, They've made all the decisions for you, and it's stuff that.
And I love the Trader Joe's example here because, for example, when the property next to us used to be a ball field, the church should have bought it in the 1960s when they were going to put the interstate there, and they changed their mind because the church could have had all of that land for $10,000, but the church didn't have the money. So otherwise, financially, the church would have been fine. But so there's a ball field there that was going to be developed, and they'd have neighborhood meetings. We'd often host the neighborhood meetings in the church because this is a big space in the neighborhood association. So we'd have them in and we'd host them. And again and again and again, people in the community would say, we want Trader Joe's. And the city officials would say, Trader Joe's is not coming here. Well, why wouldn't Trader Joe's come here? Because the economic demographic of my community is not what Trader Joe's is looking for. Well, what is Trader Joe's looking for? Trader Joe's is looking for a particular, there's these things called precept studies that church planters will get when they're planning on where to plant a church, because they've got the whole population broken down, and those of you in marketing and business know all about this. They have the whole population broken down, and they have all the analysis on what certain people in certain neighborhoods want and what percentage of them are there. And what is Trader Joe's? Trader Joe's is already a pre-filter with social status built into it. In other words, it's the opposite of the internet. It is the walled garden. And you could have 20 options of canned black beans, but no, you get one. And Trader Joe's has chosen that one. And in many ways, even though Sarah mentioned Costco, Costco is the same way. I am a regular shopper at Costco. Costco pre-filters what it puts in the store, and things come and go in Costco. But it pre-filters, and you then are part of the elite select club who shops at the pre-filtered store. And so again, this consumer choice is something that we simply don't get around. And well, that leads then to this, which is the next part of this conversation, which is something that I've heard for years, all the way back into the 80s in my seminary days, when some people would say, I go to the closest Christian Reformed church to my home. It doesn't matter who the pastor is. It doesn't matter what the music is like. Well, back in the day, all the Christian Reformed churches were the same, but
is a certain quality and that you like, and so it's really freeing. Like, it's that. Yeah. Like, going to Trader Joe's is easy.
Yeah. But it's, my point is, it's not. So when I lived in the Dominican Republic, I lived in a little town, and you'd go to the store in the little town, and your selection was limited. But it's not the same kind of limitation as Trader Joe's. The selection was limited by the constraints that were in the system. It's sort of the difference between famine and fasting. And Trader Joe's is, in that sense, sort of a cultural fast.
There's benefit in thinking having that pre-curated for you, so you just don't have to do all the mental work for it. And obviously having the curation happen over thousands of years by many people across many countries, many geographies, many cultures, many.
In other words, we don't want the tyranny of Mark Driscoll. We want the controlled trimming of a structure for a couple thousand years.
Movements and wars and all that kind of stuff, like that curation can be really powerful in like saying, no, we're going to distill this down into something very simple for you to participate in. So I get why those older traditions maybe are starting to appeal now to people.
It still feels difficult though, because I've talked about this with my husband too. It's like, well, we still have the choice. It's not like we live in a place where
and she lives in a very rural state. So she doesn't have anywhere near the choice as, let's say, someone like Sam, who's living in the Chicago area.
If we decide to attend the Orthodox Church, we're driving an hour. There's a Catholic church
you could leave
right down the road. There's a million choices that are much closer. We're not limited, so that's still, it's hard to figure out what the right decision is in that, in that instance, because we are still ultimately deciding. But I guess what we keep going back to is that if we since we do have these options, we do have to choose what is it that we're choosing to submit ourselves to. And if we do choose to submit to that thing, we want it to be something that has that longevity, that depth, that history behind it.
And not a guy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. Or a set of 5 guys who are currently in charge.
What if his name is Peter and he sits on a throne in Rome?
Mm-hmm. Right. And part of my solution to this problem is I'm going to like the closest Bible church to my house, and that no one's name is on the marketing bulletin, and it predates my grandparents, so at least hopefully it could outdate my grandchildren, right? And I'm going to that one. Why? Because it's the closest one, right? And man, do I disagree with it theologically, but I'm going and I'm biting the bullet, and this is the best that I can do with the paradox of abundance of choice that I can manage right now.
But I think that's a great choice. Like, that's what I honestly think, I mean, people are going to do whatever they want. So like whatever
I love Luke.
I think is irrelevant, but I've often said that, like, even with my beef or Charlie's beef with me, I'll correct that, not my beef with Charlie. There was, because that's his thing. He's just like, you're just this.
Luke, finish your sentences, Luke. It's so bad, and I'm just the same way.
Evangelist for orthodoxy. I'm like, no, I'm not. I just talk about my experience and what I like about it. But like what you do, like what you just described doing, perfect. I think that's basically what everyone should do, because again, it's about true community and knowing people and Dunbar numbers. So like when you just pick the closest church to you and go there, and you can, I almost wish everyone would do that. And part of me wishes that I could do that.
And at some points, that's exactly what people did, because there was one church in the neighborhood, so you went to that church. But once you've got some theological well, I'm only going to go to, well, which churches are you going to go? You're going to have a filter. Is it going to be the Trinity? Is it going to be Reformed? Is it going to be Orthodox? Is it going to be Catholic? And, you know, I saw, so in New England, I was talking to a friend of my mother's who was explaining how she would always go for Mass every day. She'd go to daily Mass every day to the church just right down the street from where she's living. But then on the radio, she began to hear, she had, this was Trump. This was Trump in terms of the Roman Catholic Church. And she was a big Trump fan, and she was against the vaccine. And there was a priest in a local parish who it had been known that, no masks in that church, no restrictions during COVID, against the vaccine. So now she's driving half hour, 45 minutes daily to go and receive Mass daily at that Roman Catholic church, now driving past the Catholic church that is just 2 or 3 minutes walkable distance actually from her home. So this yeah.
Too, it's just like, and I thought about it actually, there's like this little Lutheran church that's dying, so like
it's dying for you, Luke. Go to the Lutheran church.
Rent it out to other people. We're like, it's on the next block, like the next street over, so I'm a block away.
You could walk there in the Minnesota snow.
My churches, the church that we go to, there's this little Annunciation Chapel that's across the street also, but you got 2 churches you could walk to through the snow, Luke. And we thought when we were like making the move to Orthodoxy, like when I went to my last kind of Protestant church, I was thinking like, well, we could maybe just go to that church, and it would just be local things and this old. But part of my problem was I just had so many, like I was basically trained in this tradition of the young, restless, and reformed camps, like a Driscoll type church. And so like that was, like, what is that? It's not a denomination. It has no real like historical roots, although you can trace back some of its lineage through different things. and it may not last. So like I often call myself an evangelical mutt. Like I grew up in a
house,
denomination. No, I'm blanking
town.
on it.
You don't remember the kind of church you grew up in?
Whatever. But I've gone to just like all these different church denominations growing up throughout my life. And so then it's just like, so then you think, like, what am I? Like, what is my tradition?
Ooh, we're having an identity crisis here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have one. It's just like this nebulous, amorphous, non-denominational, evangelical thing. And so like, what does fidelity to that mean?
Right.
Same exact way too.
I don't know. And also, if I tried to stay faithful to like a young restless reformed church, I would lose my mind. Like my wife, that's actually why we left, is my wife was just like, we have to go. Like you're so miserable and upset all the time. Like it's affecting our family. Like it's destroying our family life because you're so upset about this stuff all the time. Because talking to a young restless reformed person about theology is like torture.
That little short episode, I don't know if you all have listened to it. It was like a 15-minute bonus episode in the Mars Hill podcast. And he talks about liturgy and the shaping effects that it has. And I think that's not an unimportant consideration as well. I mean, if you're attending a church that is shaping you in one way, and it's not to be more like Christ, that's a big deal. It really is a big deal. So I think that's where you could.
What do you mean by more like Christ? Tell me about that definition.
Shoot holes in the idea of just going to the church that's closest to you. I don't know. I mean, these are things we're still wrestling with. So
right.
Again,
I do go to the second closest church to me because the first closest one I do not trust.
I'm excited. The church that I will be going to in Charleston, or at least starting, trying out, is within walking distance. Like it's only a few blocks away, and so we're just gonna try that. I think it's the oldest congregation south of Virginia, which is cool too. But there's a really good article that I think you guys will like. I'll send it to you. It's called "What the Hijabi Saw." And it's about this. Is a Reformed pastor who was going to a Church of England service, just visiting, and they were having a choir service. It was some kind of festival or feast or something, and so he's just going there because of the liturgy and the choir and all that kind of stuff. And so, but there was this girl who was sitting in the pews who's wearing a hijab, so clearly from a Muslim background, or is currently a Muslim or whatever. And so but she's sitting in this Church of England service, and this guy was pretty critical of the Church of England because they're he considers them like very liberal and that kind of stuff, and the preaching that he's not going to agree with. But then he wrote this article saying, okay, but what did she see? Like, even if ignore the sermon, what did she actually experience? And he just walks through the beauty of the liturgy of sin and forgiveness and repentance, and read 2 Bibles, recited the creeds, like all that kind of stuff. And he's like, so even ignore the sermon, like even if you don't agree with the sermon, like she saw the gospel acted out in a certain way in front of her, even though like a lot, maybe even the priest doesn't even believe that. Like she still saw it because of the liturgy. I thought it was a really good article. I'll send it to you guys.
Mm-hmm.
I already like it.
And so people might wonder, like, what does this all have to do with Mars Hill at this point? And good question. But I think that the answer is something like this is sort of the legacy of people who grew up some way looking towards it or related to it in some way or another. Obviously, Tripp, like, super directly related, but like part of the reason why the podcast is popular is because it's like the most extreme archetypal example of a pattern that a lot of people have experienced.
Yep.
Right. And like, okay, I never went to that church, but like, man, I can listen to the podcast and I get all sorts of weird, reminiscent heebie-jeebies because of all the things that are similar to things that I've seen. Right. And it's interesting that it almost seems like it was the end of a train of thought that crashed and didn't have anywhere else left to go, and that the only choice is to do some serious backing up and reconsidering after it. and all of us seem to be in various similar but divergent ways wrestling with that same question.
Yep, I think it's exactly right.
And that goes, I mean, you were talking about Trumpism and Americanism and all of that. I think it's just going along with all of these things that are crashing in society too. I mean, it's the end of, in a lot of ways, it's the end of the consumerist project. And in whatever ways the church tried to jump on that train, it's all coming off the rails, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I think that there's going to be more train crashes coming.
All right, we're going to go back to the sex thing. We'll save the sexy stuff for last. I thought this was an outstanding part of the podcast. And again, Sam knows a lot about ancient church history because he's a heretic. And if you have to defend your heresy against all of the Trinitarians around you, well, you better brush up on your church history. And so I thought this section, because
have this conversation and not talk about the sex stuff a little bit, because you were saying he was teaching kind of orthodox sexual ethics, and I think there are many interesting ways in which I'm not sure that's true.
Yeah, what I meant was like mainly on like the LGBT,
right.
Yeah, not on the like sex positivity like stuff. And I think that it's interesting. I agree with that. But again, that was a way to stand out, right? Mm-hmm. Be explicit, say it from the pulpit.
Because that was this is a weird thing, because he's like kind of, reactionary trad in some ways, right? Like the way to stand out in Seattle is to, like emphasize big families and stuff like that. That was very countercultural. But then, the really strong emphasis on sex and marriage should be really great is not very a traditionally Christian emphasis, to say the least. And he talked explicitly from the pulpit about these things in a way that I think he is the most extreme example of that I know of by far.
I mean, John MacArthur wrote a review of his Song of Solomon series, and he titled the article "The Rape of Solomon's Song" because of how critical he was about how explicit Mark was being in the pulpit about these things. Very, very critical.
I mean, but how
I was talking
now this is again one of these similar. How are you going to be edgy and stand out in a place like Seattle where everyone expects you to be sex negative? Well, be sex positive, and suddenly a sex positive church?
How much of the criticism is just because these other guys just can't have as good a sex because they're beta males?
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest about that.
They need to be Chads. Yeah. No, I was talking to my wife about this last night. I think that it's hard. I'm still like thinking through this because she brought up a good point, and she just, after listening to the podcast series, kind of started thinking about this a little bit more. I think that one of the reasons that it's really dangerous, and maybe why Christians I don't think like any Christian pastor would be like, no, sex should not be great when you're married or anything else like that. They wouldn't say that. But then there's a question of,
I love it, Mrs. Doubtfire, when she's Robin Williams is doing this. I said, brace yourself, Effie.
like, why don't they preach on it more or emphasize that it should be and that kind of thing? And so my wife brought up a good point last night that she's just now thinking through, is that a lot of times like the directives that like he's giving about like say oral sex and that kind of stuff explicitly in the pulpit, that like you should do this, you should whatever. The problem is that you are speaking to a crowd, not to an individual. And there's a lot of people that have like really bad experiences around some of these subjects from their past, and it's really dangerous to tell a woman who maybe has had problems that she should be doing these things, even if we can agree that that's the ideal, and like it would be ideal if whatever, she might not be ready for it. She might not ever be ready for it. It might not be good for her to do that, her specifically. Even if we say generally speaking, like this is fine or even good, like it might not be good for the individual to be told this. And so
now, I've made the point before about the culture not taking yes for an answer. Tripp he's over on the complementarian side of things, okay? But one of the things that you find in this generation, let's say, as opposed to perhaps caricatures of past generations, that, Tripp is a guy who is from all appearances, sensitive to people's needs. And as a society, we are far more sensitive to people's feelings and people's needs, and a little bit careful about some things, even if we don't necessarily stake out positions that certain groups say we should stake out. And I think this is a great example of a group taking yes for an answer.
Like, my wife had some of those experiences, and so now she's just now kind of unpacking, like, what effect did this have on me? What effect did this have on our marriage? Me hearing some of these things and trying to like live up to them in some way, that in ways that I just wasn't ready for, and maybe I'll never be ready for. And so anyway, so that was just a thought about that specific thing that my wife brought up that I thought was a good point.
I think the ideal of what good marital sex is also an interesting topic, because on the one hand, is your marital sexual life supposed to be a pornographic fantasy, which, some people think that that's the case, or is it, on the other hand, something that is not the ultimate in and of itself and actually points you to a higher spiritual reality, which is, from my reading of church history and historic Christianity, seems to be the case. It's that.
Now, what's one of the fascinating things that I thought of when I was thinking, when I was listening to this, okay, so we've got a heretic, we've got a woman, we've got, then you've got two guys who traditionally, probably, depending on where on earth Luke is at any given time in terms of his church desires. All four of these people are incredibly well educated, deeply experienced. Despite Sam's, Sam probably knows more about Trinitarian debates than I ever will. All four of these individuals are in many ways better set up for church leadership than many, many people in past centuries were, in terms of the level of education, the level of sophistication, the level of sensibilities. Could not all four of these individuals be elders, even though I suspect Sarah, this female eldership or church leadership, would be contra to Sarah's position about what church leadership should be. And Sam, of course, is a heretic, and we all know this about Sam. And he plays his role in our community, in our estuary. But it's astounding the level of education, sophistication that all four of these individuals have with respect to these issues. And, if they were all, I guess, 3 doors down from my house and I had the church here, maybe they'd come to my church, and I would certainly be looking to all of these four individuals for leadership in our church. Now, of course, leadership doesn't always have to be ordained leadership into office, at least in the Christian Reformed Church frame. But, I'm amazed when I listen to this video, so impressed at how much wisdom, experience, thought, education, each of them shows in this video. And so on one hand, the rise and fall of Mars Hill, the church, you can be very down about it, but when you see the quality of these people wrestling with these issues, I can be nothing but encouraged.
It is a passion along with hunger, but there are reasons why church practices lead you towards the ability to get beyond even needing that in your life and not having it. Not that it's not part of life and it's a necessary component of life, but just the emphasis on it as this ultimate thing that is equivalent to, a pornographic fantasy seems to have kind of been, emphasized in the whole purity culture and all of that stuff.
I thought in her comments, the use of the word pornographic in terms of a certain quality. And of course, you've got the famous Supreme Court Justice quip on, yeah, I know it when I see it. But it's very interesting in this whole Mark Driscoll context, all the sex stuff, as Sam called it. It seems we don't really have a lot of capacity to really process it well, but we know it's something that we must, because how does the church think about even marital sex?
Right.
It's okay.
Yeah, and,
whatever you want to do, it's fine. Just get married first. But it just doesn't.
No, and that's you know, Katie also grew up in like the Josh Harris you know, time, and he very much was a part of that, and so it's amazing how influential that was. But I mean, Mark took that and dialed it up to 40, right? And just made it really, I mean, at least Joshua Harris wasn't that explicit about what he meant by, you know, those things. But anyway.
What's interesting, because I was in that culture too. I mean, I heard some of the Driscoll stuff that he said and things, but again, like that, the spirit was present, even if you didn't have a personality like Driscoll that just like would say jokes and things. Because I'm almost certain, I mean, Joshua Harris was, so CJ Mahaney started Sovereign Grace Ministries, and Joshua Harris was like his Timothy to the Paul, you know, like CJ was the Paul. Joshua Harris took over for him, was the lead pastor at his big church in Gaithersburg, Maryland, that we called the Mothership. And I think CJ wrote a book also.
One of the most recent ones talking about church structure, and multi-campus churches. Another big issue in this that we won't get to in this video.
So I probably have it on the Song of Psalms. I was just trying to think of the name, because it was, I mean, I didn't read Mark's book, I don't think, but that book was the same thing. Like we went through Song of Psalms quite a bit. It was just like, I will climb the tree, I will lay hold of its fruit. Like those verses, like we preached sermons on them, you know?
Right.
And
it is interesting that the sex positivity thing did grow up kind of alongside when the internet was becoming really widely available. And so therefore porn,
again, this like opposite dynamic going on,
became much more available. Like that is an interesting correlation, that like that's when that happened. That didn't happen in the 90s when internet was slow. Like that happened in the 2000s, and that's when it became like the popular message. To Sarah's point, like this is what we're doing, just talking about like making your marriage sex life a porn. And how much were they even aware that maybe that was influencing them?
Do you think that's what it was? It was like, this thing is happening. We need to set up like a capitalistic, competitive market. So like you're gonna have dream sex with your wife, and it's gonna be the best ever, and it isn't gonna be this flippant thing. You know, it's not gonna be this like passing one night stand thing where you're just like the crumpled slutty rose. You know,
because that story that Mark told, where there was the wife who attended church but the husband didn't, right? and then he basically encouraged the wife to tell the husband, I am going to do some oral sex for you right now because my pastor told me to. So, and then the husband starts showing up to church. You know, like whether or not that story. Thank you, Luke. Whether or not that story is true, you can imagine that pattern was actually probably representative of a lot of reasons why a lot of people actually were showing up for church. And I think, I mean, I'm going to try and keep this as brief. I think a weird...
And part of this is the transgressive quality. Let's think about that term when thinking about Mark Driscoll there. If political correctness and ascendant morality orthodoxy is socially enforced in Seattle, then Mars Hill has a transgressive nature to it. But with respect to sexuality in other Protestant churches, Mark Driscoll, like Tripp said, is going to turn it up to 40. It's going to have a transgressive quality to it. And it's those crossing barriers that grabs our attention. And again, you can build if you do a whole bunch of other things right, if you work on the music and the presentation and all of these other metrics and get the buzz going, you can build a big organization and in that way gain status among your peers.
thing is, like, I've been going through the church fathers and stuff like that on my YouTube channel, and like I can't help but admit that virtually all of them are extremely sex negative. Like, they'll say things like Christians should only have sex as much as a farmer should put seed in his soil to get the crop that he needs to harvest, and in the same way
it's
that
very Augustinian too.
in the same way that
And back in those days, you might have needed to have 10 or 12 or 15 kids to, harvest your soil. But today, everybody's like, well, 2. So there you go, honey. We get to do it twice.
that a farmer doesn't waste his seed to get to not get any more crop. Take the metaphor to its logical conclusion that sex is bad, but you should only have as much sex as you need to have as many children as you need, right? Because sex draws you away from God. And even then, like in early Christianity, it was common for married couples, once they got past the childbearing age, to then suddenly have a celibate marriage, like where they were like a nun and a monk that were married to each other, right? So that then they could pursue greater holiness and abstinence.
Look for this story in the video conversation I posted recently in Bless Me, Father, for I Have Sinned. That's what I entitled the video.
Right, like that was actually a common early Christian thing, and it sounds like super weird now, but that
even to go as far as leaving each other and going to monasteries in separate locations, I've read.
Right, yeah, and they didn't get
Why
divorced.
would you have sex if you can't have kids?
Well, right, that was honestly the idea.
But
and
it also
I think,
obviously was, it was obviously influenced by especially early on, the heavy influence that Plato and kind of Gnostics were having, where like your body.
Again, these people are probably in some ways better educated than many clergy in churches in past generations, and perhaps even today. All 4 of these individuals. I mean, it's really an amazing thing to just pause and pay attention to.
Body is kind of like the lower form of and so like a lot of your appetites and that kind of stuff, like you should deny them, like they're bad. This world is bad, the material world is bad, your body is in some sense bad, and we need to reach the spiritual plane. And so I think that a lot of that was also like kind of this Platonic influence which was growing at the time.
But how is it that it's not that much different than fasting, right?
No.
And this is another interesting thing that Protestants. So I mean, as far as I know, the first like sex positive Christian was Martin Luther. Really, like Martin Luther, was a monk, started Protestant Reformation, got married, and then he would talk about how much he enjoyed his marital relations with his wife, right? And he was perfectly happy. He was Driscoll-esque in his own way in the 1520s and 1530s.
No, it's
and that is a big fork that I feel like Protestantism really invented in Christian history, as far as I can tell, was that instead of the
So all y'all Catholics and Orthodox, we're the sex positive ones. So, either, I won't say it.
Sexual ideal for Christians being celibacy, that there was an exception for marriage and procreation as something that was not, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't the ideal itself, right? And then Protestantism says, no, we're going to take that celibacy thing off of the pedestal and put married couples having children with good sexual relations at the top. That was actually, I think, one of the biggest changes. I mean, Protestantism had a lot of different changes, but that was a big change. And I think that it's important to say that.
Yes, and I think you can. So
it's also important to know that, especially early on, Protestantism was an urban movement. And so you're going to have different dynamics because, again, in urban households, you're, even without reliable birth control for many years, you're going to not want to produce as many children. And of course, then some of the dynamics between Catholics and Protestants in urban settings and the number of children they have. And obviously, if you're living in a rural community, many children may in fact be helpful in terms of affluence, whereas in an urban setting, having many children might make you poor. So there's lots of layers to this.
So for Protestants, I mean, this you can as a Protestant, because you can just, go back to the Bible, you can take that early church stuff and you can explain it away, because you can just say like, that's where they were just wrong, and because of Bible.
Mm-hmm.
But as someone who's in a historically rooted Christian tradition that has this continuance thing, you can't really do that, which is probably why, even within, it's funny, I don't know, what you see in here depends a lot on where you're standing and the kind of person you are. So as I've moved into Orthodoxy, like I've probably moved towards that, like even, because Orthodoxy is probably, even though they don't carry it quite the same way that Catholics do.
Will Luke overshare?
They're very much along those lines of natural.
I think he would overshare if he finished any of his sentences. And again, I do this all the time. You know this if you listen to my videos. I love Luke.
Family planning, sexes for procreation. They wouldn't take. It's just much more in continuance with this kind of stuff. I think that's kind of standard practice.
And so I think that an interesting thing, right? Like, so Protestantism takes that stance. And then during like the Jesus movement of the 60s and 70s, there was an even greater degree of sex positivity in the Christianity of the Jesus movement because, hippies, right? And it's the 60s. And then I feel like, because basically...
And that's right. The counterculture. And in many ways, the counterculture is... I can't wait for Tom Holland to write about this stuff. The counterculture is in many ways a continuation of the Protestant Reformation in some ways.
Basically, what suburban megachurches are, they're Jesus movement baby boomers. The Jesus movement was for hippies that didn't have kids or responsibilities, but then they grow up, they get married, they have kids, they get a job, they move to the suburbs, and now they need a church for their family and their kids. And that's basically what megachurches are, right? That's when they show up, is when baby boomers start having the millennial children, which is us, right? And then so it's like, man, what are we going to teach our kids about sex? And it's like, okay, well, we don't want them to have sex before they're married. How do we get them to do this in this, post-sexual revolution age? Is we say, we hold up, man, there is great sex at the end of the tunnel. You just need to get to the light at the end of the tunnel, right? Man, if you wait till your wedding night, baby, it's going to be fantastic. And it'll be so much better than these kids who are like tape that's lost their stickiness because they've stuck and unstuck from too many people. Right? Like you guys have heard these analogies too. I'm not making
Sarah,
this
were
up.
you the one that...
Now, this is amazing because these are all millennials. And I'm of an older generation. We didn't have any of that. It was just sort of socially understood, you don't do this, but there wasn't any of that. I think another piece of this is the intentionality that, as I think Protestantism found itself more and more under stress culturally in the 80s, that the intentionality, the visibility, the upfrontness of all of this just really got turned up on the millennial generation. It wasn't on my generation. It was sort of understood that you wait until marriage, people would have children out of there'd be oopses, there'd be births that were 6 months after the wedding, not 9. There were all of these things, and there's a degree of social enforcement, but and even in the Christian Reformed Church in some places, a couple might have to get up and basically confess their sin before the church that, they did the deed before they got married, and you had shotgun weddings again. But by the time we get to the millennials, it all just gets turned up, and now it's at a fever pitch, and I think partly, again, also because of the pill. Now suddenly, whereas socially there was the threat of, you might have, so I came of age in the 70s and 80s, and so the pill was starting to come on, but, the pill has been ongoing greater and greater perfection ever since then. And so it's just interesting how these dynamics changed and what now this generation, because all these four are millennials, their experiences, let's say, compared to my experience, and then there's obviously a generation older. My mother is still alive. That generation is still around, and some of you are listening to this video, and you could tell stories about this.
Brought that up? That someone told you that?
I think I brought...
Sam,
did you? Okay.
I was talking.
Oh, man.
I brought up the wilted rose, like the analogy that was passed around in youth groups, where they would pass around a white rose and have everyone touch it, and then at the end they would say, "Do you want to be like this?" You know, just disgusting.
Ooh, yeah, right. And that was the idea, right? Like that's what American evangelical purity culture was stay pure until you're married, and then once you're married, have at it, right?
But now I think in the Civil War that we sort of began with Sam talking about, the two sides don't quite know what to do. Because the side, the traditionalists that want to maintain the Christian standard position on human sexuality, well, the tape and the crumpled rose and the purity culture, that didn't work out so good. So how do we talk about this? And the other side is like, it's not even don't ask, don't tell. It's just don't police. We're not going to police any of this. People are going to do what they do. But you can get into my point that, hey, no policing means no policing. Are you going to police the clergy? Because what we're doing is having a severe policing of clergy sometimes and a no policing of the laity. Well, that's not going to work out because, again, in some ways, your clergy continue to be an idealistic intensification of the people in the pew. That's part of how leadership works.
And that was sort of the marketing pitch, and it's had a lot of problems. And like, I didn't realize how different that was from most of Christian history until I started looking into it. And I feel like Mars Hill is like that to its absolute maximized extreme.
Even if you said you were going to be biblical in holding up marital sex as the ideal versus celibacy, I mean, Christ himself was not married. I don't see how you could do that, even if you're just looking at the Bible.
That's because he had to be for his mission, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, even Paul, when he talks about like married couples, like, kind of fasting from sex in a way, and like, going away for a period of prayer, but don't do it too long. But his reasoning was, don't do it too long because you might be tempted for it, even to sin in some other way. And so like, yeah, so it wasn't like he wasn't making the argument come back together because this is an inherent good and you shouldn't abstain for it for very long. More like you need to come back because there's really a lot of danger in abstaining for too long as well. So now it was a different argument than obviously what Mars Hill or the sex positivity folks were saying.
So it's essentially, well, interestingly, I don't know if we want to go here, but it's a concession for weakness, right? Like you haven't conquered your passions. So you should come back together so that you're not burning with lust, you're not burning with desire. But then I've also, so I don't know if we want to go here, but.
All right. So then they go other places. So anyway, it's a great video. I've played ample portions of it. I've added some of my own things, but the Randos channel has some great conversations. They have some, and obviously the individuals here are, it's just they're doing a great thing. So I hope this was helpful. Leave me a comment. I'm sure the Randos will find this pretty quickly, and they will be in the comment section, and you can have at it with them in the comment section, especially with Luke, if you don't like someone who doesn't finish their sentences.